Can you explain what went wrong with Ferrari for them to go from 1 and 2 on the starting grid to finishing 2 and 4?
Here's how Ferrari's mistakes took them from P1 and P2 on the 2022 Monaco Grand Prix starting grid to finishing the race in P2 and P4. Both Ferraris and both Red Bulls were on full wet tires from the start of the race until the end of lap 16, when Checo came in for intermediate tires after seeing the success that drivers like Pierre Gasly were having on them. At this point, Leclerc was 8.3 seconds ahead of Checo, and Sainz was 2.9 seconds ahead of Checo, so the Ferraris were not too worried. Now this is where things start to go bad. In order to prevent Checo from undercutting Sainz and taking P2 from him with his new intermediate tires, while Sainz was of course still on the slower wets, they called Sainz in to box to match Checo on the intermediate tires, wanting him to come in at the end of the next lap, lap 17. But Sainz thought this was a bad idea, and during what was supposed to be his lap 17 in-lap into the pits for the intermediates, he and Ferrari had a lengthy radio discussion about how Sainz thought the circuit would be dry enough for the dry weather slick tires in about 5 or 6 laps, meaning that pitting for intermediates now would be a bad call because they would just have to come in for another pit stop shortly afterwards. After twice telling Sainz to box, Ferrari eventually tell him to in fact stay out like he asked for. But this conversation around pitting Sainz took so long that Ferrari did not have time to tell Leclerc to pit for intermediates at the end of lap 17 and cover off Checo himself instead of Sainz covering him off. This delay meant Leclerc would have to come in at the end of lap 18 for intermediates to try and close off Checo, but that extra lap on faster tires gave Checo enough time to successfully undercut Leclerc, who came out of the pits 3.3 seconds behind Checo. Ferrari team principal Mattia Binotto would later admit that Ferrari underestimated the pace of the intermediate tires relative to the wets, meaning they did not think Checo's undercut would be successful. Now, Leclerc could have prevented Checo's undercut from happening by protesting the pit decision, just like Sainz had, but we later learned that Leclerc didn't protest because he did not even know that he was going to be on intermediates. There was a huge communication error here. So let's rewind and get the full story. On lap 14, Leclerc told his race engineer the circuit was drying up quickly. On lap 15, Leclerc's race engineer asked Leclerc what he thought of going straight from full wets to slicks and skipping over the intermediates, to which Leclerc replied, "Yeah, could be a thing, but not now." 3 laps later, on lap 18, Leclerc said, "Inters would be much quicker for sure," in a late response to his race engineer saying the previous lap that Checo was now on inters. But when Leclerc was told to pit later that lap, he was not asked if he wanted inters or slicks, nor told that Checo was on to undercut him, because again, Ferrari underestimated Checo's pace on the intermediates. So it caused this crazy lapse in communication where Leclerc had been told a strategy about going right onto slicks, and he had also talked about going on intermediates, and he had no idea what he was going on to. He has said that he did not know he was going on intermediates. Surely, if Leclerc had known Checo was about to undercut him, Leclerc would have either asked to stay out or for slicks to be put on rather than intermediates if he thought the circuit was dry enough, so that he wasn't coming out of the pits behind Checo and on the same tires as Checo. So that was Ferrari's first big mistake, and it was a huge one that ruined Charles Leclerc's chance of winning the race. But at this stage, Ferrari could still salvage 2 podium positions, as Leclerc was still ahead of Verstappen and Sainz was in P1. That is, until their second big mistake, which came when they attempted to execute a double stack pit stop by putting slick tires on Sainz and Leclerc back to back. After seeing the crazy fast sector times the cars on slicks were doing, Ferrari jumped to get slicks on their drivers as fast as possible. The fastest way to do so, of course, being putting them on both cars, pitting on the same lap by way of a double stack pit stop. Now, a double stack pit stop only works when you get the timing just right so that the second driver is not held up at all in the pit lane while waiting for the first driver's pit stop to be completed. Ferrari originally thought there was enough of a time buffer for them to pit Sainz and then Leclerc back-to-back without any delay for Leclerc, but it turns out that they misjudged how fast Leclerc on intermediates was gaining on Sainz, still on his original full wet tires, on the in-lap. Where have you heard it before that Ferrari misjudged the speed of the intermediates versus the wets? Really, that right there was the cause of their entire downfall for the whole day. By the time Ferrari realized a double stack was not going to work because Leclerc had gained too much on Sainz, Leclerc's race engineer yelled at him to stay out on team radio, but Leclerc had already committed to entering the pit lane. Now, Leclerc ended up losing 3.5 seconds waiting behind Sainz in the pit lane, crucial seconds that eventually put him behind Max Verstappen after Max did his pit stop for slicks the following lap. Had Leclerc stayed out and not gone in, let's say the race engineer had gotten him that message just a little bit earlier and he had time to stay out, Leclerc would have pitted the same lap Max did the following lap and come out ahead of him in P3. But at this point, even with these two colossal mistakes that ruined Charles Leclerc's day, took him out of the top 3, Ferrari could still somehow salvage a P1 in the race by way of Carlos Sainz, who was on a good tire strategy and just needed a good outlap on his new slick tires to undercut both Red Bulls as they did their double stack pit stop. And what happened? Sainz had a bad outlap. Why, you may ask? Because he was stuck behind none other than Nicholas Latifi, who slowed Sainz down just enough to where he would wind up between Checo and Max in P2, where he would eventually finish the race. I hope that breakdown made sense. I think the broadcast did not do the best job of telling the full story of how Ferrari turned a 1-2 start into a 2-4 finish, so I hope I did. Hey Ferrari, a word of advice: leave the double stack to Wendy's.